Escoffier is an extremely simple character, quite a contrast from the talent descriptions we got in Natlan. But in this simplicity, there is a really strong and hyped up character that will definitely help revive a team archetype that has been struggling quite a bit. There is a lot to talk about, because her strength, the teams she can play in, and her builds are not as simple and straightforward as her kit. So let me first give you an overall image of what you can expect from Escoffier. She has great healing capabilities and a possibly permanent and incredibly strong resistance reduction to enemies. The catch is that this last effect is connected to the number of Hydro and Cryo units in the team and goes up massively by an amount equal to a certain notorious artifact set when all 4 units are from these 2 elements. And she does one more thing, off-field damage, and quite a lot of it. These are the reasons why she will be held in very high regard by the community, at least for the teams that can welcome her. She's a polar muser and her ascension stat is Skrrr. The normal attack talent doesn't have anything relevant, so let's skip it. The skill has a tap and a hold version. The hold version is quite different because it's an out of combat summon similar to the parametric transformer gadget that will absorb attacks and give you food. I love when Hoyo adds this kind of stuff to the game, but for the combat side, the tap version will be more relevant, since this is where she summons a cooking mech that will follow you and deal damage for 20 seconds. This will hit a single target, although with a tiny AoE, every second and deal up to 216% of her attack as damage. It will apply Cryo for auras or reactions every 2 seconds, so every 2 hits. The burst is a very simple nuke at 60 energy cost and a party-wide healing. I'm sure you can very well think about a character that you might want to play with Escoffier because of this. The healing is based on her attack and it will continue to heal past the burst cast thanks to her Ascension 1, but for a much lower amount and only to your active character. Ascension 4 is where we get a massive Hydro and Cryo resistance reduction based on the number of characters from these 2 elements. This gets applied to any opponent hit by her skill or burst, but the notable thing is that having just 2 or 3 Hydro or Cryo units will give you 10 or 15 rest shred, while having all 4 will make the passive go up by 40% to a total of 55%. This margin is exactly what you would get including an Nemo unit in the team. Moreover, the rest shred has the only condition of hitting the enemy, no need to freeze or have her on field. It's also handy multi-wave content. So Escoffier will basically solidify the awkward moment that any Fritz team encounters, especially if Furina is there. You want rest shred and a healer. Escoffier is doing both at ease and at the same time bringing damage of her own. There is only one thing lacking here, especially for a Fritz team, and that's grouping. But we will talk about this later. Talent priority is very simple. The attack talent can be totally skipped. Give the skill as many levels as possible, ideally 9 or 10 since that's most of your damage. Don't ignore the burst, it also has a really high multiplier, but it only provides the initial heal for the entire party. The rest will be up to the Ascension passive, which of course you don't level up. Her build section is interesting. Let's talk about artifact sets first. Generally, you should consider only 1 or 2 options, Golden Troupe and Blizzard Strayers. Both the sets offer a ton of good stats for Escoffier. The Fontaine set will be a ton of damage percentage, and I would argue that this is the general set you want to use. Blizzard instead gets you a ton of crit rate, especially if the enemy can be frozen. And in theory, in an ideal scenario, it's her best option, but I wouldn't really recommend it. Her Ascension stat is crit rate, and with a Cryo Resonance we would already be at a baseline of almost 80 crit rate, with 0, I repeat, 0 substats. You could also make the case for stats like Noblesse and Tenacity, however both are not totally perfect for Escoffier. We don't care about Tenacity 2-piece bonus, and Noblesse doesn't have a perfect uptime, nor 2-piece bonus as well. Cinder City for 12% damage and Song of Days Past technically work, but those are all very niche and weird options that pretty much ignore how good their damage can be, and buffing it with 70% damage from Golden Troupe is more often than not a better idea. It's also an incredibly good raising investment, especially for Furina accounts. For stats, we have an energy requirement that, in the presence of the Hydro Archon, is quite mandatory to respect. But at the same time, we ideally don't want to drop something like an attack sense for an energy recharge one. Nor do we want to drop a good damage-oriented Polyarm for Favonius. But these 2 scenarios will still be the only way to sustain a burst every rotation for many teams. Since energy recharge changes in every single team, let me just give you a few examples. In a triple cryo team, they can be as low as 110 and as high as 140%. This will depend on the amount of Favonius weapons in it, and how often you can generate energy on your characters. A Shenhe plus Ayaka team with no Favonius will still require around 130 on Escoffier. That is assuming a proper rotation with 2 skill casts each. Looking at double Hydro teams instead, energy requirements above 160 are very likely. And mono Hydro teams or teams outside the Fritz archetype are of course even worse. Avoiding an energy recharge weapon or your sense will be practically impossible, sometimes you might even need both. So overall, if necessary, still go ER on the sense, but otherwise attack will be the best in slot. Circlet will generally be crit, and the Goblet needs a long disclaimer. We're talking about a character that can end up in a situation where you have Golden Troupe and Furina, both big sources of damage percentage, that act the same way as cryo damage in the damage formula, which makes attack Goblet a competitive choice, both for damage and healing. However, there is a lot to take into consideration. Attack can be obtained via party-wide buffs like Noblesse or Tenacity, or simply in the sense and substats. How much damage your team is dealing compared to Escoffier also changes how good having more or less healing is. The weapon is also a big factor. Some buff attack rarely, and some others don't but have a high base that makes attack percentage stats more valuable. And lastly, the presence of Shenhe makes cryo damage pretty much always better since it will scale with her buff. Here's an example for Favonius Lance where any combination is better than ER plus cryo. But I don't want you to get out of this section with more questions than answers, so generally, if you can provide her with external attack or plenty of attack stats, go cryo damage. Same with Shenhe and in teams that don't include Furina. If instead you have Furina and Golden Troupe with no particularly high attack stats, especially in teams that make you go your sense, consider attack goblets. Both options are good, but don't take any number you see online at face value. Most calcs are done with a standardization that doesn't necessarily apply to everyone. I also want to add that the healing you get from the extra attack is not that big of a deal. It's mostly for her own damage that we decide to go for more attack stats. For all the reasons I just talked about, in my weapon calcs I decided to assume the need of 130 energy recharge, Furina and Golden Troupe. Different energy recharge requirement and scenarios will have very similar results to this, except for something like Engulfing, which has potential to be second or third in this list if all the energy recharge it provides gets a use. Something similar happens to Fav, but I did give it a couple of extra subs to help it out in the chart. Also be aware of Cryo Resonance. If you're playing mostly Cryo units, it will have a good uptime, even with Furina against the boss. But playing something like Neuvillette, Furina, Silali will rarely activate this resonance since the freeze reaction completely wipes out the aura. Again, I'm talking about boss encounters here. The resonance is very reliable if the enemy can be frozen. I also want to talk about our signatures briefly. This is the first polyarm that is able to directly buff other teammates. Crit damage will synergize very well with Escoffier's Skrrr Raid Ascension stat, and then we get 12% attack and 12 more when off field. After healing, whoever is healed and Escoffier will get 32% more attack. This will last 3 seconds, but will be constantly refreshed for 9 seconds. I'm low-key more excited to try this weapon on other characters, since it actually works on so many. It's usable on Yansan and Chevros, 2 really strong characters, but also technically on Yao Yao and Minka. And generally, as you can see, most 5-star statistics do pretty well and our signature is not that far off, but it of course doesn't include the attack buff given to a teammate, which is kind of big. Also, don't be scared by how low Favonius in the chart is. It's a great option since it lowers the energy requirements of your team and most people have it. Before looking at teams, let me cover the first 2 constellations. Most people skip this section, so let's make it super brief. Constellation 1 is straight up 60% crit damage for cryo units, but only if you make a fully Hydro Cryo team. This is of course a good C1. It buffs Escoffier herself, but it's ideally used in a team with Shenhe plus a Cryo fielder. C2 is instead a mini Shenhe, where your cryo hits consume up to 5 stacks to increase their damage, but unlike her, each character doesn't have their own stacks. They're all shared, which means that it's just those 5. They happen once per rotation and might be triggered by a character that is less valuable. They have a much larger attack multiplier than Shenhe, but overall not an amazing C2. And finally, the most important section. Teams. First off, I want to highlight that Escoffier is still viable outside of teams that are just Cryo and Hydro. She does lose a portion of damage, but she will still be able to deliver off-field Cryo and be a healer. Teams that use her as a melt of fielders, something like a Kinich Burning, or teams that still want to include an Anemo unit, are totally possible. Even something with Utao Double Hydro or Mavuka Melt can work. Otherwise, I'm of the opinion that she's a bit expensive, as the ideal teams are basically 5-star only teams. I will expand on this later, since I don't want to discourage anyone that likes the character and wants to play something different available to them. But first, the dream scenario for Escoffier is with Furina, in a team that only includes Hydro and Cryo. Furina just holds the perfect synergy with Escoffier because of the damage increase and healing. And if we were to put another good off-fielder here, someone like Yelan, we would have a perfect core that is able to elevate many units that have been overshadowed by the most recent characters. With this core, you have really high amounts of damage, huge res shred for everybody, buffs and resonances, to the point that a team of 3 is already pretty competitive with a lot of full teams. But now, whoever we choose to drive the team with, whether it's a Cryo unit, maybe with Shenhe, or anybody really that is Cryo or Hydro, is going to be sitting in a very strong team already. Their contribution might not be stellar, but the team's damage will still be overall very high. But of course, then adding a strong on-fielder would make things even better. That's going to happen to Ayaka, who now has her technically, hands down, best in slot team, but with a caveat. So let's talk about her first, since she's also on the Chronicle banner. I consider a good Ayaka team, even the older versions, to be quite strong, but only in the rare niche of feasible enemies that can be grouped, which is something that in the Abyss hasn't happened consistently in a long time. But Escoffier is here to elevate Ayaka to new heights. And a team of Ayaka, Shenhe, Furina and Escoffier is the most damage you could ever get out of an Ayaka focused team. Also, Shenhe has an amazing synergy both with Ayaka and Escoffier. Not only because she is buffing both, but also because both allow Shenhe to use 2-tap skills per rotation, making her generate more energy and be an overall better buffer, which is something a character like Wriothesley will struggle to do. For Ayaka, I think it's still worth mentioning that while in theory Escoffier teams will be absolutely amazing, in practice it might not always be all that great. Single target scenarios mean that it's likely a boss that can shift Ayaka's set to Marechosi, and also make it likely that her burst will simply just miss. This will come down to the precise encounter. In AoE instead, well, we have no grouping ability. If the enemy doesn't group by itself, it might even be worth it to kick a unit for an Anemo again. But to be totally fair to either argument, I have to say that Furina and Escoffier will account for a big chunk of the team's damage, which makes an Ayaka missing her talents not as bad as her classic teams, where she basically does all the damage. The same scenario can be simply applied to any Cryo or Hydro unit. Ayato, Child, Wriothesley, Kokomi can all enjoy new teams that, however, hardly differ from the triple core I explained earlier. The issue is that most non-limited 5-star options are not that ideal in these teams. Let's look at them. Xingqiu is a strong unit, but for reasons that don't apply here. All the extra Hydro applies is not necessary. We are playing Freeds, so often the damage reduction is not needed either, and his damage is single target and not that incredible. Any healer is less valuable, simply because we already have Escoffier. And we're left with a mix of supports and damage dealers that can surprisingly, especially with all the buffs provided, actually count for some meaningful damage or utility, but are generally going to be less desirable. I can totally see characters like Chongyun with his cooldown reduction, Layla, Kaya and Rosaria be used, but simply because you either have all the perfect pieces or you don't. Which reminds me of a certain unit I haven't talked about yet that wants very precise teammates to make use out of Escoffier. Neuvillette can ignore his passive of wanting different reactions and get a team that is going to give him a total of 75% res shred, Cinder City, Hydro and Cryo Resonance, damage, heals, a shield and 2 off-fielders. He does not need better teams, but Escoffier can prove very strong, especially if your alternative wouldn't fully max out his draconic stacks anyway, which is something basically always happens as C0 with Furina. But do not feel for a second that Neuvillette needs Escoffier, especially if you already have good options, and especially if you can't make this precise team. One last mention should go to Skrrr, as a very hyped up and probably Cryo character, but we will have to see. I'll make sure to update you as soon as Oyo announces anything. A big shout out to my YouTube members, patrons and members of the Ghost Gang over Twitch and Discord. Thank you for supporting me and I hope to be able to bring you more content in the future. Sub and like if you enjoyed the video and see you next time!